everyone, and welcome to this episode of An Ingenious You, the podcast where we speak with higher ed's most creative thinkers and doers. Today, I am so pleased to be joined by Dr. Rebecca Pope-Ruark, a coach, speaker, facilitator, and educator. Rebecca has recently been appointed as the very first director of the Office of Faculty Professional Development at Georgia Tech, where she coordinates efforts for all non-teaching related professional development for faculty. The author of 2 books, her most recent, Unraveling Faculty Burnout, Pathways to Reckoning and Renewal, was just released this past September by Johns Hopkins University Press, and it is generating a lot of buzz and discussion. So we will include a link to Rebecca's full bio in the show notes. But for now, Rebecca, it is such an honor to welcome you to the Ingenious You community.
Thanks so much for having me, Melissa.
We like to start by finding out something about our guests. And in your case, you've had a distinguished academic career and recently made a pivot that has led to your very quickly becoming recognized as a national thought leader on the topic of faculty burnout. And you host a podcast. I love the name of your podcast, The Agile Academic. So can you tell us how you wound up here and what's the backstory?
So I've always been kind of an academic at heart. Higher education is always where I have felt most myself. First as a student, obviously, and then in different pursuits, graduate student. Spent a couple of years in California doing marketing communication in Silicon Valley to test those waters, and realized that my heart was in higher education and that I needed to be in higher education. So I went back and got my PhD, which is in rhetoric and professional communication. And then following that, I taught at a teaching liberal arts institution in North Carolina for 12 years as a tenure track and then tenured faculty member, doing the usual things that tenure track and tenure faculty members do at teaching institutions, maybe doing it a little bit harder than I should have. And I was, to be honest, fell into a serious bout of work-related burnout about 10 years into my career as an academic. And that was a really challenging experience for me. And we'll talk more about that as we talk about the book, because the book kind of recounts a lot of that experience. But it after a lot of self-care, a lot of therapy, in all honesty, a lot of work on myself for a couple of years, realized that it was time to make a change out of a teaching position and moved. I was lucky enough to find a position at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Georgia Tech, which is a completely different world than where I had been. I'd been doing a lot of facilitating workshops based on my first book, Agile Faculty, of productivity strategies. So I was very interested in faculty development at that point, and was happy to make that transition into a different role. I was there for about 2.5 years when the role that I'm now in, director of the Office of Faculty Professional Development, became available. And that really, it was time, I think, to make the pivot really fully away from teaching for a while. And a lot of the work that I had been doing had been focused on productivity, writing, faculty writing, on burnout specifically, more recently. So it made sense to move into that position. You mentioned the podcast. The podcast was just kind of a lark that came out of the pandemic. I was feeling kind of isolated and was seeing all these great conversations on Twitter. So I just started reaching out to people on Twitter and saying, hey, do you want to have a conversation? And those turned into the podcast. And there's some really compelling and wonderful interviews. I hope your listeners will check out the podcast, because some of those, all of the women that I've spoken with are just amazing. So it's been a fun couple of years. If you can say the last couple of years had any fun elements to them whatsoever. But my career has definitely been on an interesting trajectory for the last few years. So it's been a bit of a ride.
And congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And it's obviously resonating with many people who are resonating with your experience. So the fact that your book is so deeply personal, I think, is part of the reason behind its success, and the fact that people are responding to you and saying, you're describing the experience that I'm having or that I have had. So can you say something about what led you to share your story in such an open and vulnerable way? I can't imagine that was an easy decision to make.
It's interesting how it really came about. It was a couple of kind of parallel paths happening as part of my therapy journey and really working through the burnout and the struggles that I was having. I started writing my experience, just kind of vignettes from the experience that I was having, that seemed like important touch points to the experience. And those were just for me. I am a writer by nature, and because of the burnout, I hadn't been writing for a long time. So being able to sit down and write something again was very nurturing for me. So getting those stories out and getting some of those vignettes out was a way for me to process some of the things that had happened and to understand what was going on and how I was feeling. Because I'm not someone to that point who had been very in touch with her emotions, I would say. So it gave me a way to process a lot of what I was going through. And at the same time, as I was kind of going through my experience, I went to a conference. I was on medical leave at one point, took a semester medical leave for my burnout was so severe that it was causing health problems. But I had already paid for a conference. So I just went to visit with friends at this conference. And at that point, I wasn't feeling ashamed of it anymore. There was a lot of shame associated with it initially, but I was on medical leave and I just told people that. Hi, how are you? I'm going through a burnout and I'm on medical leave right now, but I'm working through it. And it was amazing and kind of sad how many people, once I said those words, either were there to share their own experience or someone who had been close to them or was close to them in their work experience. So pretty much everyone had a story, and I missed most of the sessions because I was talking to people in the hallway or in the lobby about burnout related issues. So as I thought about it, it became one of those things that you just kind of see that no one's really talking about this, but everybody's experiencing it. So how do we have that conversation? And as a writer, and as I had been writing the vignettes, it made sense that maybe this was a book, that there was something, that there was a larger context here. My voice was not the only voice that needed to be heard. And it kind of developed from those tracks.
Well, when you were on the front end of experiencing burnout, as you know, there was virtually no attention being given in higher ed at that point in time. So it really did take remarkable courage on your part to come to terms with this, to be honest with yourself. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you did, in fact, come to terms with your experience, what some of the signs and the symptoms were that caused you to have the most concern, and then what some of the specific steps were that you took to begin to address the burnout.
Mm-hmm. One of the kind of insidious things about burnout is that we don't talk about it. So we don't have a language to be on the lookout for it in ourselves or in our colleagues, but also the World Health Organization doesn't define burnout as a mental illness. It defines it as a syndrome. So a collection of symptoms. And what I was experiencing was a collection of symptoms. And the symptoms that I knew and understood were depression and anxiety because I had experienced those all my life. So I knew those things were happening. I was also in this shame spiral because I was so far away from my writing. I couldn't write anymore. I hadn't been able to write for months, and that was just daunting to me. And then I also found myself, and one of my key kind of symptoms of burnout was I was really disillusioned about teaching. Almost completely. And I have always been a teacher's teacher. Being in the classroom was where, I belonged for 20 years. And to feel that way about teaching and to feel so negatively about my students who are wonderful, growing human beings, doing what human beings at that age do, was very concerning to me, very concerning. So I happen to have a physical or something. And, they do the screenings for depression sometimes. And I was just honest at that screening, and my general practitioner recommended a therapist. And I said, okay, I should probably do that. I sat on that phone number until my husband took it from me a couple of months later and called and made an appointment. And it was then when I explained kind of what I was feeling. And at that point, and I talk about this in the first chapter of the book, the experience in that room with that therapist the first time was very much really me trying to convince her that I just needed ADD medicine so I could focus, because if I could focus, everything would be okay. If I could write again, if I could grade again, if I could teach the way I used to teach again, everything would be fine. There was nothing else wrong with me. It was just this focus issue. And yes, I was depressed. And she asked me some questions, how therapists do, and, kind of got in, we were having this kind of series of questions. And she asked me, how long have you been miserable at your job? And I said something like 7 years. And that it was that moment where I really just kind of stopped and said, okay, wow, right. This is my dream job. This is the job that I have always wanted, at a wonderful institution with wonderful colleagues and amazing students. Am I miserable? What's wrong with me? And she said, you know what? You don't need ADD medicine. You're burned out, and you're probably so burned out that you might not come back from it if you don't take care of yourself soon. And we need to deal with this. And then we had to deal with it. So how did we deal with it? A lot of therapy. I'm fully honest and open about that. I still do therapy regularly for the depression and anxiety and the burnout, because I want to stay on a good path. For me, it took changing jobs. I was really far gone in my burnout. There's the Maslow burnout inventory is the research instrument that's most validated for identifying different levels of burnout. It's not a clinical diagnostic tool, but a research tool. And when I took that at the beginning of my burnout, right after that first therapy session, I was off the charts. So it was clear that things needed to change. And after a while, my husband and I decided that it was probably time to make a big change. And we were lucky enough to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, and what a great change you have made. And also being able to then focus and get this book out, which is obviously helping a lot of people. Were you surprised when your therapist named this as burnout, or did you have an inkling? Did you kind of think that might be what was going on?
It's funny because I didn't have any language for it at the time. Like it didn't even occur to me that was a possibility, that my job was impacting my health. This didn't even occur to me. But as I was flipping through notes for some articles that I had wanted to write when I wasn't being able to write, I found in the middle of one of the pages the word burnout circled with a question mark. I don't remember writing it. I don't remember when I wrote it. But it had come across my radar at some point. So when she said it out loud, it was a wake-up call. And as academics do, you run to the research and you look things up and you read as much as you can. And then it was undeniable.
Yeah, well, it also strikes me that it must have resonated with something deep inside of you, that you were able to then reorient yourself and push yourself forward, as opposed to, denial or, the other kinds of ways that you could have responded. So from your experience and observation, and I think I know the answer to this based on what you said about your experience at the conference, but how big a problem is faculty burnout in higher education, do you think now?
Huge. I think it was endemic before the pandemic. I think, higher ed as an industry has been in retrenchment and losing funding and, experiencing so many ups and downs with enrollments and just so many cultural and social and economic and political attacks that so many of us at all types of institutions have lived in some state of, oh my God, what's next? What's going to happen next? And how do we do more with less? And then how do we do more with even less? Because that will just become the norm. That bar will just keep going up. So I think that it was already a problem. It was already a problem. And we have studies that show that. But I think the pandemic obviously just shot it through the roof for so many different reasons. And when we talk about burnout, we talk specifically about workplace-oriented stress. The World Health Organization defines it as a workplace syndrome, cause syndrome of unrelenting stress that has not been successfully managed. So we focus on the workplace piece of it.
So what is it about the higher ed workplace that is such a good breeding ground for burnout, even without the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a lot of things. And I have a chapter in the book on this too, because I think it has a lot to do with what we might kind of classify as academic capitalism. So capitalism is dominating our industry in ways that we are not acknowledging. And yeah, that's economic, of course, but it's also in the way we work with each other, right? So, productivity is the name of the game. The more productive, the better. At what costs? We're not talking about that. We're just talking about high levels of productivity that causes competition. And when you're in a constant state of competition with your colleagues, it's difficult to find community. So that causes problems. It causes, you get exacerbated aspects of perfectionism and imposter syndrome that make it miserable for people to do the work that they do and be psychologically safe. So there are just, the conditions are rife. There's this also this sense that higher ed is a calling, that fewer called and fewer still will make it. Fewer still will get that holy grail of a job or a tenure track job even. And that, that was one of the things that caused so much shame for me, was that I had the perfect job, what I had wanted my entire life, and I was miserable, and someone else could have that job. And I was kind of holding on to it when I didn't really want it anymore. So it's really that sense we get, if our work is a calling, you will give everything to your calling.
Yeah.
There's no line there. You will just keep working. You will work all the time. It will constantly be in your mind. So that combination of calling and academic capitalism is just a perfect storm.
Well, and I wonder, as somebody, I have worked at mission related colleges my entire life, resource constrained mission related colleges, which are notorious for how shall I say this? Taking advantage is, I guess, the
Sure.
maybe the not so positive way, taking advantage of people's sense of calling and the willingness that people will have to burn the candle at both ends on behalf of that calling and on behalf of the mission to their own personal detriment. So is that a unique experience, or is that also a part of it?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a factor. I think that shows up in, for some people, that's the mission driven. For some people, it's the research imperative, right?
Yeah.
And the grants driving them, there's some piece of it, I think, at every institution or every type of institution that we see. Certainly with mission driven institutions, we have I don't think there's an easy way to say that. Then yes, we're going to take advantage of people because people can be taken advantage of. Do I think that administrators are maliciously doing it? No, of course not. It's so embedded in the way we've always worked and the way the additional capitalism has pushed higher education to function, that it's just embedded at this point, unless we start pointing it out.
And thank you for pointing that out. I don't want to leave that impression either, that that administrators are, doing this intentionally. However, I do think the you have a number of different things that are intersecting, particularly right now, given the the uncertainty around economics and everything else affecting the demographic cliff. And so leaders, administrators are, understandably very, very worried about the future of the institution. And then you have folks that are, giving their all to do everything they can. And anyway, so all of that is to say, I think you are saying, yes, this is a very big problem, faculty burnout in higher ed. Now, can we talk a little bit about women in particular? And I know you write about this in the book. Women's experiences with burnout, are they different?
It's interesting. So the research is not overly conclusive that it impacts men more than women. Some of the research does show that it impacts us differently. So there are as part of that definition, there are 3 characteristics of burnout that are kind of the diagnostic kind of characteristics. There's exhaustion, cynicism or depersonalization, and feelings of reduced professional efficacy. So some of the research that I've read shows that the exhaustion piece tends to show up, be the dominant piece. You need all 3 of them to have that burnout, but the exhaustion tends to show up more in women. In men, they're more likely to revert to cynicism and depersonalization. Now that's only a few studies. It's not huge. But I personally didn't necessarily set out to write a book about women faculty burnout. It was a process that just kind of ended up that way. And I think there are reasons for that. When I initially put out a call for people's stories, and I had a great mix of folks, who were interested in submitting, but by the time it came to actually submitting, the people who were able to follow through were mostly white women. And I had a really honest talk with my editor about this. This clearly isn't the book that I set out to write. I'm not writing the white woman burnout book. But it told us a lot about psychological safety. It told us a lot about who feels the agency to be able to speak about this right now and who doesn't, where people might be experiencing so much additional emotional labor that going here is not something that they can do, even though it might resonate with them. So I ended up doing a lot of outreach and interviews and talked to a variety of different women on the subject. So we did narrow it into women, but women were willing to talk about it in ways that men were not.
Are there some themes or things that you learned about the experience of women faculty that contribute to their burnout that looks a little bit different than
Sure.
what you think might be the case for men in particular?
Yeah, there's several things. And I think, one of the biggest and the most obvious is that women tend to have more care duties than men do. So family duties or outside care duties. So that adds an additional layer of stress and fatigue and feelings of shame and guilt for not working hard enough. So that adds a layer. I think, another aspect that came out of the work piece, I think, is definitely emotional labor, additional emotional labor, additional service load as well. So we know that women are much more likely to spend more time with students, to be more emotionally attached, to experience some secondary trauma from working with students. We know that women will often take on more service loads than our male colleagues will. So in some ways, the calling is again causing the problem, right? Because women have committed in certain ways, and we're committed in different emotional ways, perhaps, than our male colleagues are. So that leads us potentially into situations of additional emotional labor and service load that cause additional emotional labor. So I think there's a bit of a catch-22 there as well.
Well, and it raises the question of boundary setting as well, and whether that's a skill that women maybe have not honed or are not willing to exercise to the same extent that men do. I don't know. Is that something you observed?
It's not something that I observed, but in doing some research more recently, I do think that, we're not taught to do certain things, and, we're not taught to feel content about what we do, and we're not taught how to say no, and we're not taught that there are variations between yes and no, right? So, the idea that someone comes to you and says, do this, a dean comes to you and says, be on this committee, there are variations of things that you can say in response to that, that aren't, this is not, if I say no, I'm not going to get tenure, or if I say no, I'm not going to get renewed, or whatever it is, right? So we don't really talk about the shades between that, of how we can negotiate some of that labor. And I think that if we did a better job having conversations about that, things like that, I think it would be helpful.
You've written that having endured burnout, you more easily see it in others. And I wanted to ask you about this. What is it specifically that you see that might cause you concern for others? So for those of us who work around faculty every
Mhm.
day, what are some things that would help us see this,
Yeah.
either in ourselves or in others?
Yeah, and I think the easiest place to start is those three World Health Organization characteristics. So the first one is exhaustion, and this is, we're all exhausted. It's the end of the semester as we're recording this. People are tired. Absolutely, we're all done with the semester. But this is exhaustion that permeates everything. It's emotional, intellectual, physical. I think we start looking for ways that the exhaustion is causing physical problems, health problems. I was always sick and I was always claiming it was my allergies, and I didn't notice it, even though my colleagues around me noticed it. So physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, that cynicism, that we see this a lot this time of year on Twitter, for example, people who are castigating their students for doing something ridiculous or whatever it is. And, I joke kind of that, sometimes those people really are just assholes, but a lot of times they could just be burned out and they don't know how to handle it. And it's coming out in that cynicism in a public way. So that's another thing. I think if cynicism is an unusual behavior for that person, some people kind of are naturally cynical, and then I think that, really that third characteristic is questioning, what's the point? Like, am I making a difference? Am I doing anything? Is it worth doing what I'm doing? When someone is really questioning that, and they are, for all intents and purposes, great colleagues and, hard workers and loving their students and doing their research. When you start to feel like, what's the point, very deeply, like you feel it in your bones, like, what is the point of me doing this? Am I making any difference whatsoever? I think those are some signals to look for.
And then how would you counsel somebody if your colleague, you're seeing these things in a close colleague, what would be helpful?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky conversation, right? I mean, and another thing we're not always trained in is crucial conversations. How do we have those conversations? In my own case, when I did talk to, there were two senior colleagues in my office suite at the time, and they had been worried about me for a long time, but didn't tell me that until after I told them that I was experiencing burnout and going on medical leave. So, what would have happened if those senior colleagues had talked to me beforehand, had just sat me down and say, we're worried about you. You're working really hard and we appreciate all that you do, but you're also sick a lot. And, maybe it's okay to take a break every once in a while. Or, had talked to the chair and said, maybe she needs a little break from this committee structure or something. That might be going too far, depending on the kind of relationship that you have with your colleagues. But, I think it's, if you come at it from a place of, I'm concerned about you as a human being, not I'm concerned about your productivity, right? I think so. I think it comes in the approach. And I think it comes in, not sneak attacking someone, take them out for a cup of coffee and just, say, how are you doing? You seem like you're struggling a little bit. How can we support you?
Yeah, it is tricky, particularly if there's a power balance or imbalance in the conversation. But if it's just another colleague, I what I'm hearing you say is that it could be helpful to at least provide the opportunity for somebody to talk, express what they're feeling.
Even say the word burnout. I think that, we don't, when I was experiencing it, nobody was talking about it. The words were not, coming out. There was literature, but it was in the literature. It wasn't, we weren't reading widely about it. It was popping up here or there. So I didn't have language for it. I didn't have, a way to explain it. And because I think there's shame associated with what burnout does to your brain, in the sense of it feels like you can't do your job anymore. And there's so much shame attached to that, because that's not something that you want to show in higher education, some sort of quote unquote weakness, or that you can't quote unquote hack it anymore in that competitive environment. So it's something that you hide. And, that obviously that just makes it worse. So, if the words are out there and we're talking about it, I want to say casually, but not, you know what I mean? That we're having these conversations more broadly, that people are reading about it, then, you know, I think we have a little bit more conversation power with our colleagues.
Well, and hopefully it normalizes it,
Exactly.
which will help everybody to have the conversations, but particularly those that are experiencing it, to know that it's a very normal thing and it's nothing to be ashamed of.
And it's not one of the things that and my work is definitely moving in this direction more now, is this idea that we have to normalize talking about burnout, but we have to denormalize the culture that causes it. So it's a workplace problem. This is not an individual problem that's impacting a workplace. This is the workplace impacting people's lives with the culture and the way we do things. So we have to start, yes, we have to take care of each other. Yes, we have to have individual interventions for keeping ourselves well, but you can't self-care your way out of this culturally. Right? We have to start changing the culture to make a difference.
And what are some of the most important things that go into that? If you were czar of a campus for a day and you could change 3 things that you think would really move the dime in this regard, what would they be?
Goodness, that's such a question. And that's really kind of where my thinking is starting to head, because I am focusing much more on the context now. And I don't know, well, I'm actually kind of excited because Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter, who are some of the original burnout researchers, just published a new book, and they do focus on culture as kind of some solutions for that. So I've just started that, and I'm excited to see kind of what they've come up with. But they talk about, and I think this is very true, they talk about misalignments that cause culture problems when there's a mismatch between the person and the workplace. Some of those are workload related. Some of those are values related, fairness, community, so how do we look at workload, and workload doesn't just mean your course load. There's so many other things that we're expected to do and keep up with all the time. So there's workload issues. I think values, I think, is something that is crucially important, because we talked about mission-driven institutions. A lot of places speak values or speak mission and then act in a completely different way.
Right.
In the day-to-day. So how do we align those things and actually have, cultures and behaviors that actually fit those values? Because when that misalignment is there, that's rife for burnout for everyone, especially if the institution's kind of enacted values are clashing with your own values and morals. Right. So there's challenges there. So I think probably workload is probably a place that we need to work at. Community building is what we need to be looking at, and values are what we need to be looking at. Consistency.
So now you write eloquently about some of the strategies that you have employed for overcoming burnout. And I was particularly struck by your 4 reflective pillars. Mm-hmm. These seem to be really good practices for people to employ, whether they're fighting burnout or not. So I'm wondering if you could help unpack each of these, starting with re-articulating your purpose and values. So what is that? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think when you're values driven, you have a heuristic for making decisions and for thinking about your life and your work. So I think all of us came into higher education for a reason, right? And we've talked about the idea of a calling. Many of us felt called to this work, called to be educators, called to be researchers. So what is it that was behind that? What skills and talents are you bringing to make what kind of impact? And, why is that important to you? So I think if we can reconnect to that original purpose, or figure out what and articulate what that purpose is now for you, I think that gives you a foundation to work from and to make decisions from. My purpose had changed. The burnout had shifted my change, but I had already been on a trajectory that was moving toward faculty development anyway. So, when it made sense for me to shift the purpose, because I was still being an educator, just in a different context within higher education. So I think with purpose, it's really, if we know what our values are and we have a sense of that purpose, we have a foundation for making good decisions about our work and our life and balance and those kinds of things.
Great. The second, practicing compassion. Now, it sounds easy, but how do you actually do it?
I was just going to say that's the hardest one, isn't it? And I think, this one goes back to me kind of from the shame that comes out of burnout, I think, and the self-talk that can get into your head, the shaming and the, what's wrong with you and why can't you do this anymore? And, it can get to be so negative. And I think that we also, when we are emotionally connected to the people that we serve, our students, our colleagues, it's much easier to fall into compassion fatigue over time, to just get exhausted and not be able to take other people on. And then we move into kind of secondary traumas. So practicing compassion is about recognizing those things, right? Thinking about your own self-talk and how you talk to yourself. Is that the way that you would talk to a student or to a colleague or to a friend? Thinking about how you can change that, thinking about your inner dialogues and how you talk to yourself. But also being able to recognize when you might be falling into something like compassion fatigue, that, this isn't about this person. You're at your limit. So let's look at strategies to deal with that so that you can still be the compassionate person that you are. And not fall into more shame because you feel like you're not that compassionate anymore.
Number 3 is seeking out connection.
This one has become a lot more popular in my workshops and been a lot more requested in my workshops. And, there are obvious reasons for that. I mean, many of us felt very disconnected during the pandemic when we were all working from home. Well, many of us were working from home, not all of us. But there was mission during the pandemic, like get the education done, make sure students are learning. And I think there was a lot of connection happening because we were seeing humanity in each other in very different ways. And I would love for that to continue. We're seeing signs that we're reverting back to the kind of the way it was beforehand. But we need connection. We're human beings. We need connection. We need connection to each other. We also need connection to other pursuits outside of our institutions and our work, to keep our brains healthy and to keep, to keep our lives fulfilling. So, that's family and hobbies and pursuits and, animals, connecting to nature, whatever it is that fills you, making sure that you're making time for that.
And then 4th, striving for balance.
This one I'm actually starting to reconsider a little bit. So this one is, I think that word is problematic. And I think a lot of what I'm talking about, I recently read a book by Matthew Kelly, I believe, who talked more about work-life satisfaction than balance. That when we talk about balance, what we're really talking about is an absence of satisfaction. So how do we, quote unquote, balance the different areas of our lives so that we are feeling satisfied and we are feeling fulfilled, knowing that there's not a 50-50 balance of work life at any point. That's an arbitrary, like, why are we even talking about that? It's all one life. So thinking about how do we bring our purpose to what we do? How do we bring our compassion and our connection with others and other beings and other, interests? And how do we put that in motion that, sometimes that's going to mean working more. And if that's happy for you and driving you and there's a project that you're in love with, and sometimes that's going to mean spending more time with family or on a different pursuit. So I think it's maybe it's removing that sense of like work-life 50-50 balance and really thinking about what satisfaction looks like instead.
About your new work at Georgia Tech. I'm very impressed that your institution is investing to such an extent in faculty professional development. So tell us more about what you do there and what your vision is for the work.
Yeah, so I lead the Office of Faculty Professional Development under the Vice Provost for Faculty, which is also a new position under a new provost. So and there were absolutely some wonderful people doing faculty professional development before it became an official office, and there was a directorship, those kinds of things. And they were doing great work, but they were also doing other things. So I now focus completely on faculty professional development. And like you mentioned earlier, that covers everything that's not teaching and learning related, in which our Center for Teaching and Learning handles. It's a little bit of a strange kind of split between those two. Sometimes you'll see that, a lot of times those two things are merged. But I am an office of one with a fantastic supervisor who's eminently supportive of the work that we do. And our goal really is to help our faculty create satisfying, productive careers and want to stay as a Georgia Tech faculty member for their career, to find a home here. So I do, my background obviously is as a writer. I'm a writing professor, my writing PhD. So I love working with faculty writers. I run writing retreats, virtual writing retreats. I work with writing scholars. So we really dig into their writing processes and grow in that way. We're running some mentorship development work, programming. We do, your standard kind of professional development workshops on managing your email and saying no. We're doing some things about writing productivity and writing pipelines and strategic planning next semester. We're moving more into leadership development work. We'll be taking some programs in from other areas, I think soon. We'll be doing more with that. My office also runs all of the new faculty orientation and extended orientation work during the year. So we run programming for our new faculty to make sure that they have a good kind of sense and foundation for being at the institution and how things are done and where to look for different things, so that they feel members of the community as well. So it's a lot of different stuff all the time. Every day is different, but I wouldn't have that any other way.
What a great opportunity for you.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm really happy.
Yeah. So, well, good luck with all that. Is there anything, Rebecca, I did not ask you that you would like listeners to know, either about your journey or about some of the other things that you're doing? You're also an executive coach. That's how you and I first met, in a coaching program. So I know you're doing more with that as well.
Yeah, I do a lot of coaching internally for our faculty. That's another major service that my office offers for faculty. And that's a wonderful way to help faculty think about strategically planning their next few years, or dealing with a difficult, situation, or how to, build a good lab structure, people structure. We talked about values, and, Georgia Tech really, with a new president and new provost, they doubled down on values, and they talk them, they live them, and they're putting their money where their mouth is on a lot of them. So it's a great time to be at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, well, that's terrific. And I wish you all the best. And I'm going to look for your next book to come out at some point, but no pressure. I don't want to put any pressure on you.
Okay.
So, okay, take care.
Thank you.